Well, hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. It is a great pleasure, great honour, and I'm doing it. I'm sitting here in the upper rotunda of the Jerwood Centre on the Dove Cottage site, what we now know as the Wordsworth Grasmere site. If you can picture the Jerwood Centre, that small round building in front, the top floor is a library dedicated mostly to our collection of books on the English Lake District. What we sort of come to know, haven't we, as the discovery of the Lake District, as we call it, from 1750 onwards, which saw an influx of tourists and artists and writers to the Lake District, leaving behind many travel guides, travel literature, print, drawings, watercolours, and that is very much part of the collection at Grasmere. As well as, of course, the primary manuscripts of William and Dorothy Wordsworth, the other romantics, the published books, and the manuscripts of them as well. So it's very much at the heart, I'd like to say the heart of Cumbria, certainly the heart of the Lake District. And as I said, it's a great pleasure to be talking to you with this collection around me. I should also say that it's a great honour to be a fellow of the University of Cumbria. It was one of the proudest days being in Carlisle Cathedral, receiving that honour with so many people present, and thank you to the university for always making me feel so welcome and part of it. And also I'd like to dedicate this in particular to the English department at the university, led and inspired by Penny Bradshaw, who's always a great pleasure to work with. A great energy, as I say, and great inspiration for her students. And the MA students and the BA students who visit us, usually in person, but more recently online, that's just a great pleasure as well. And so in particular, I'm thinking of those students who have brought such energy and interest to our work, and to those who have been such loyal participants of our webinar series that we ran towards the end of last year. Their enthusiasm, your enthusiasm, if you're watching, that keeps us going. And each year, students come and we spend a workshop in the Jerwood Centre Reading Room, and it's near towards Christmas. It's one of the lovely ways that we end the year, and as Penny and I often joke, if I haven't started my Christmas card writing by then it's about time I did. So it's to the English department and the students that I'm thinking of particularly with gratitude as I give this talk. It's going to be PowerPoint. I'm hoping to do it in a single take, and I know, and I hope anyway, that you'll forgive any technical hitches along the way. So I'm going to move now to a PowerPoint, and hoping that this first challenge goes well. So forgive me for a moment. In my nearly 40 years of working at the Wordsworth Trust, I've seen it transform from being a heritage attraction of house and museum welcoming at its height about 87,000 people a year to a place welcoming closer to 40,000 people a year, but with an integral state-of-the-art research and learning facility and wide-ranging learning programs that go beyond the traditional visitor and the day visit to the site. About the final third of this presentation will show examples of how poetry lives and does good in work that we do in partnership with other people, away to a large degree from Grasmere. And I invite you, as you watch it, to think how we could work together to enable it to do the same for the people in your lives, both professional and personal. And my contact details will be on the final slide. The Trust owns Dove Cottage, that's the Wordsworth Trust, owns Dove Cottage, the home of William and Dorothy Wordsworth between 1799 and 1808, and from 1802, the home of William's wife Mary and 3 of their 5 children. Here, William wrote most of his greatest and best-loved poetry, of course, the best-loved being I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, perhaps the greatest, The Prelude, and Dorothy wrote her Grasmere journals. Dove Cottage is in the hamlet of Townend, Grasmere, in the heart of the English Lake District, and the Jerwood Centre is our collections and research centre, holding 70,000 books, manuscripts and pictures, and amongst which are 90% of Wordsworth poetical notebooks. And here, uniquely, we can read William and Dorothy's words about the place, composed in the very place and on the paper in which those words first became physical manuscripts. People, poetry, and place, and the collections which embody their lives and their works. We're currently undergoing another major transformation, Reimagining Wordsworth, thanks largely to a grant from the National Heritage Lottery Fund, and building on many years of development as a member of the Cumbria Museums Consortium with funding from the Arts Council England. And it's important to acknowledge and thank both those bodies and many other organisations who support our work. Many of you will know the site. There you can see in the centre and the heart of the matter is Dove Cottage, and surrounded by its garden and a little strip of woodland that we now own just outside it. The existing museum, the old museum, again, some of you will know, a converted coach house here. There's the Jerwood Centre, opened in 2005. Some of you will remember this as the bookshop. This is now going to become a cafe right in the heart of the site as well. So the visitor experience will be very much this within one side of the road, cottage, museum, garden and shop. Down at the bottom corner here is what used to be the tea room. That will become a dedicated learning centre. And then just above it is another small garden, and that will become a sensory garden. So there will be more green spaces open to visitors. We'd hoped, of course, to open it for Wordsworth's 250th birthday in April 2020. That, of course, couldn't be. We're hoping at the time of giving this talk that we can be open by his birthday, his 251st birthday in 2021. That will be April coming. So let's keep our fingers crossed. Let's hope. At the heart of everything we do in terms of interpretation is in this sentence here. Here, about 200 years ago, William Wordsworth wrote groundbreaking poetry that he hoped would live and do good. And the here, of course, can be Grasmere, it can be Dove Cottage. His wish for the poet's usefulness to outlive him and to make a difference to people was often expressed by Wordsworth. He first used the phrase live and do good in 1804, writing to his friend Richard Sharp. I pray God to give me life to finish these works, which I trust will live and do good. Expanding on this hope, he wrote to Lady Beaumont in 1807 that he wished his poetry, quotes, to console the afflicted, to add sunshine to daylight, by making the happy happier, to teach the young and the gracious of every age to see, to think, and feel. And writing to Henry Crabb Robinson in 1835, he said, if my writings are to last, it will, I myself believe, be mainly owing to this characteristic. They will please for the single cause, and this is a quote, that we have all of us one human heart. And that's a line from his poem, The Old Cumberland Beggar. We see the role of Wordsworth Grasmere in 2020 as fulfilling the poet's own wishes for his lifetime's work. In Reimagining Wordsworth, whether looking at a visit to the site or an activity elsewhere, we hope an immersion in the poetry, people and place will take people, even only temporarily, away from what Wordsworth calls the attractions of a busy world, and a world, he said, that is too much with us. But who is our audience? Who do we serve? A survey made a few years ago found nearly half our visitors were over 55 and 78% were white. Our typical visitors have sufficient disposable income to consider coming to Grasmere, the physical means and ability of getting here, negotiating our site, a confidence that an overwhelmingly white profile of museum and locality will be a comfortable experience, and an education that did not leave them feeling that, quote, poetry is not for me. And that's an expression I've heard many times in my many decades at Grasmere, that people enjoy the visit, they're very interested in what we do, but they have to say that, well, poetry is not for me. It's not my thing. Well, we would just, in a friendly way, challenge that. But for many others, our site and the poetry we celebrate are not easily accessible. In looking to help this wider audience overcome barriers, we take our inspiration from Wordsworth and a letter written at Dove Cottage. In a letter written in 1802 to John Wilson, a young Glasgow student, Wordsworth, who was a self-declared reluctant letter writer, wrote 4 large pages defending his poem, The Idiot Boy, published first in 1798, against the accusation that a story about a mother's love for her disabled son was not, and the phrase that was used, a fit subject for poetry. The title of the poem, The Idiot Boy, understandably causes us discomfort today, as it did Wordsworth himself, as he mentions in writing this letter. He argues that Wordsworth did not find pleasure in the poem because its subject was beyond his experience. And he said that what Wilson lacked was a comprehensiveness of thinking and feeling. And if you can make out the quote here, this is an extract from that letter. It says there, people. It says, people in our rank in life are perpetually falling into one sad mistake, namely that of supposing that human nature and the persons they associate with are one and the same thing. And then down below, he carries on. These persons are, it is true, a part of human nature, but we err lamentably if we suppose them to be fair representatives of the vast mass of human experience. For too long, many museums have focused on the people we are used to associating with. And in recent years, and especially in the light of Black Lives Matter, it becomes excusable not to work harder to overcome barriers faced by people in the wider, to use Wordsworth's phrase, in the wider mass of human existence. So the first part of what follows will focus on how we're hoping to make the poetry live and do good for people within the ticketed visit to the site. And the second part will highlight just some of the instances where we believe it has lived and done good in other ways. I'm just going to pause for a second to see if it's recording. Yes, all good. So we'll carry on. So let's think about the site visit. We do not assume a visitor arrives on site with any knowledge of the subject. We hope they'll be disposed to discovery, whilst at the same time recognize that some will have an antipathy and some are accompanying others out of obligation or even, if you like, avoiding the weather. But nonetheless, most people's minds will be preoccupied with 21st century busyness. To borrow from William's Tables Turned, we invite people to visit with a heart that watches and receives. Initial engagement and awakening and a transition into a more mindful and receptive state, a slowing down, is key. Many literary museums focus on the lives of the writers rather than their words. From the moment we, the visitor, enter the reception area, we encounter Wordsworth's words, a 2-story high wall of 5 key lines. And you've been reading some of these words in the last few minutes. Here we wait for our guide. We'll next encounter the wall just before we leave the museum, by which time the lines may resonate with us a little more. Perhaps we'll hear them internally in time to come, as a Scottish peasant girl singing in The Solitary Reaper lived with Wordsworth. The music in my heart I bore, long after it was heard no more. For many people, poetry is a fancy of little value. 200-year-old poetry in archaic language, how can that be relevant to us today? Well, our guide takes us to watch a film shown in a one-time stable in Dove Cottage.
I turned to Wordsworth for solace, to lift my heart, to restore a sense of wonder in nature. He saw in nature a kind of healing spirit, an environmental vision about what nature brings to us, which is very important nowadays as we think about how we are failing the planet.
William had a very deep friendship with his sister Dorothy. Two creative minds at work at the same time. You get a real sense at Dove Cottage of the joy they took being able to share everything, that their life and their poetry were inseparable.
Wordsworth really is a poet who you can grow up with. The poetry can speak to you when you're in your 70s or when you're 17. The two words that come up again and again are joy and love. We could all do with as much of that as possible in our lives, and I think the poems offer it.
So if we can imagine then after seeing this that poetry matters, if poetry matters, well, why then does Grasmere matter? Why does Dove Cottage matter? And how was this poetry written, and why does that matter? So we're kind of, through this little film, moving people from the outer to the inner, fine-tuning as we go. And the film tries to show the importance of the poetry and the place that inspired it.
I cannot but admire the fortitude and wonder at the success with which he has laboured in that one room, common to all the family, to all visitors, and where the children frequently played beside him.
From here, we enter Dove Cottage itself, as if we're stepping into the film set. We'll be invited to make ourselves at home, as if we were visiting a friend's house. For the next 20 minutes, we can sit and immerse ourselves in the atmosphere, imagining what it might have been like for real people living ordinary lives, but writing extraordinary literature in what Thomas Quincy, using some of Wordsworth's own words, described as a life of plain living and high thinking. We may talk to our guide, to each other. We may read the words of the Wordsworths in manuscript facsimile. The words are all around us, should we choose to read them. The many artifacts around us contain stories taken from the surviving poems, letters, and journals. But we need to look. We need to look and we need to think. As in Wordsworth's poem, Simon Lee, the Old Huntsman, "O reader, had you in your mind such stories as silent thought can bring, O gentle reader, you would find a tale in everything." Only in Dove Cottage can we feel what their home was like, seeing, thinking, feeling what Wordsworth would have his poems enable us to do. It's how we experience their lives and words in this place. Can we imagine the words that have been spoken and heard, the conversations, the laughter, the children's voices, the tears? The home may awaken our imagination, guided by our watching and receiving heart. From here, we can walk out the back door, perhaps weather permitting, reflect further on these thoughts in the orchard garden. The loveliest spot that man hath ever found, wrote Wordsworth, their little domestic slip of mountain, as he described it, full of fruit trees, vegetables, and flowers, and with views across the valley. We can walk in a little woodland, prompted to sit and think a while. And here we may encounter activities for young people, seeing, thinking, and feeling. On entering the museum, we are faced with the question that this talk is seeking to answer. In this place, writing this groundbreaking poetry that he hoped would live and do good, were his hopes fulfilled? Does his poetry live and do good today? And we look upon, if you like, an essence of Wordsworth, very, very hard to define, impossible to define, but for three things, if you like. Wordsworth calls for us to reconnect with nature. He asks that we show empathy for others, and he encourages to nurture our creative imagination. And in 4 galleries, we'll meet the people, poetry, and place through the Wordsworth family's manuscripts and possessions. And we'd invite you to think of manuscripts in a way that goes beyond simply the words on the page. It can be that when you enter a manuscript exhibition and you see rows of manuscripts, which at first glance can look very much the same, difficult to read handwriting, require energy, and it does require energy, and one can be forgiven for it not being so immediately attractive, say, as an art gallery with paintings. But we would invite our visitors to think of the manuscripts as more than just words. The words are important. The words are uplifting and consoling. The words give us information about their lives, if we're thinking about letters, for example. But the letters, all these manuscripts are part of people's lives. They're certainly the author, there's often the recipient, there's the reader in years to come, there's the family member, and they are about people. And looking over a manuscript, it's as if we're looking over the shoulder of someone as they're writing, and to think about the character of the person that comes out in the handwriting, that the mood that they were in, their sense of anticipation, either excitement maybe, or joy, or sorrow, but they're real people, and they're creating these manuscripts in real time, and they will have an audience in mind, even if that's just themselves as writing a journal. And I'd like to sort of give an example of that by looking at this manuscript. I hope you can see in the little screen that I'm holding up like a little packet. And where's the camera? There we are. So perhaps you can see that it says on the front, and the Heron Coleridge at Ratsburg. You maybe can you possibly see that it might say Goslar on there as well? You can certainly see a big ink splat, and we know that that ink was spilled after this paper was folded because of the way it's penetrated through to the other sheets. But this, even in the little screen, I hope you can see, looks something like a letter. There's the seal on the back, and this is how letters were. There were no separate envelopes at the time. And I would like you to imagine Coleridge, if you can possibly imagine this, his great friend Coleridge in Germany, the Wordsworth not far away at Goslar, but him receiving this. And he was missing his friends, William and Dorothy. Well, he writes in a letter earlier the month that this was written. He said, "William, my head and my heart, dear William and dear Dorothea, you have all in each other, but I am lonely and want you." So can we imagine what he must have felt on receiving this letter from his dear friends? Expected, but still a wonderful thing to treasure. And can we imagine what he must have felt when he opened it? So again, I'll try and do this. I know it's tiny, but if we imagine opening this letter, opening it out, and you can see there's the address panel, maybe on one side, and then on the other side is a whole page of writing. And this is page 1 and page 4. Of course, there's pages 2 and 3 in the middle. Now, when we put it on the screen, it looks something like that. So you can see here, there's the address panel, which we looked at there. There's the address panel, laid out flat. So again, you've seen with this one that down the center of the page here is a fold. So there's page 1 and there's page 4. And then on the other side is pages 2, page 2 on the left, obviously, and page 2 and page 3 on the right. And so Coleridge must have been amazed opening this and finding this gift of poetry. And Wordsworth, William and Dorothy had been in Goslar. It was freezing cold. It was the coldest winter for 100 years. Their flat, their apartment was so cold that to go from one room to another, they tell us, they had to put extra clothing on. They'd gone to learn the language. William hoped to learn through conversation. This was almost impossible. It was a kind of lockdown situation. The person they saw most often, it was very difficult to communicate with. I think he had difficulty in hearing, for one thing. So Wordsworth turned his thoughts inwardly, and he thought about his position in life. He was at this point 28, Dorothy a year younger, and Coleridge most recently and he had talked about Wordsworth writing the great poem of the age. We know this poem in time became known as The Recluse, but this was a massive challenge for Wordsworth. And he's in Germany, he's thinking about this challenge, and he's thinking about, how did it come to this? How has my life so far shaped me to become the poet that Coleridge believes that I to be the great poet of the age? So in other words, has his life so far been for this moment? Was it for this? Was it for this that his life has been as it has been? And he thinks about his childhood experiences, and he writes these passages, some of them in a notebook that we now know as Dorothy's journal, and includes the passage Dorothy writes about seeing the daffodils at Ullswater with William. So he's writing these drafts in the back of a notebook. And he goes for a walk. This is December 1798. And on one Friday, I think it is, he goes for a walk. And while he's out, Dorothy takes this sheet of paper, and she starts on page 3, and she says, you're at a place with a lake and skating. William's been writing about skating when he was a boy. And so I'm going to write you out these lines. So these lines here, she writes on this page, and in the frosty season when the sun was out and visible for many a mile. And some of you will recognize this as lines that became part of the Prelude, the poem that Wordsworth dedicated, wrote 8,000 lines, his greatest poem, about how he became this poet, the growth of a poet's mind. And he starts in childhood, and here he is writing some of his earliest memories. And then further down the page, Dorothy writes out another boyhood experience of Wordsworth, one evening. And it says here, led by them, which Wordsworth has crossed out, I went alone into a shepherd's boat, a skiff, which to a willow tree was tied. And again, some of you will recognize that these two are lines that becomes part of Wordsworth's Prelude. They carry on over the page. So all this left-hand side down here is the episode of rowing a boat on Ullswater. And then there still isn't room here, and you can maybe see at the bottom there's a letter B, and the B says, okay, still not finished, and so come up here. And so vertically there are lines that finish off the boating scene. So we've had the skating, we've had boating, but then there's another description that Dorothy would like Coleridge to read, and that comes up at the top. So up here she said, look, there's another one, and this one's about a nutting scene when Wordsworth was a boy. And to read this one, you'll have to go back to the other pages. So we go back. That is the end of the rowing scene. Here's the passage about nutting. You can see on the top line, I will now transcribe a nutting scene. And so we now go back over the page, and on the left-hand side, if I can get this arrow to show you here, this is the nutting scene. So all this is nutting. Now this runs out of space as well, so there's an asterisk there, which takes you to here. So here's some more of the nutting scene. This is the second part of the nutting scene, but they're still not finished. So there's a letter D that you can maybe see there, and that takes you up to here. So there's more of the nutting scene here. So what we're looking at here is skating, boat stealing, and nutting. So that's. I mean, how long does that take Dorothy writing with a quill? How long would that take her to write? Now, at this point, I'm suggesting that William returns, and he picks up the paper and he starts writing on this side. Now, you can be forgiven for thinking his writing is remarkably similar to what we've just been looking at as Dorothy's. Well, in truth, this is also Dorothy's writing, because Wordsworth, or I should say William, suffers badly writing with a pen. We heard before that he was a reluctant letter writer. Well, what he would often do is dictate his words, and others would write them. So in this instance, it's Dorothy. So Dorothy is writing out at William's dictation. Now, you can see here, William writes, and it must be strange for Dorothy writing about herself in a kind of way, but she says, this is what William says, Dorothy has written the other side of this sheet while I have been out, she has transcribed a few descriptions. So a few I'm taking to be 3. So that is the skating and the boat stealing and nutting. You will read them at your leisure, he says. She will copy out 2 or 3 little rhyme poems, which I hope will amuse you. So, if we go back, there's the letter, there's the first of the rhyme poems at the bottom of page 1, and then we turn over again, and at the top of page 2, there is the second of the rhyme poems. So, we've got all the blank verse, we've got the letter, we've got the rhyme poems, and that still leaves 1 or 2 little bits of paper, fragments of paper that haven't been written on. And you can see that Dorothy puts lines around them. So there's one at the bottom. I'm sorry, I'm struggling with my mouse to make it visible, but you can see there's one there, and then there's one at the bottom right there, and there's another one in there. And in here, Dorothy writes little comments to Coleridge. And one of them, she says, because she knows he's suffering from eye trouble, that recognizing that, you know, he will have trouble reading this letter, and that she says, I begin to be half afraid that you'll tire before you get through it. But then she says, but no, you will not. So this is how this has come together. It's 2 people sitting in a room, writing a letter with Coleridge, their great friend, in mind. The thing that Dorothy hasn't yet done, of course, is to sign it. And so on page 4, there's a little bit of land, a little bit of paper here, not yet written on. And so she writes here, look, God bless you, dear Coleridge, our very dear friend, D. Wordsworth. And that was, makes me think, why doesn't she put Dorothy? It's interesting that William doesn't begin his letter, dear Coleridge or dear Samuel. He just launches straight into conversations on German literature. But here, dear, God bless you, dear Coleridge. And it's signed D. Wordsworth. So then, presumably, Dorothy writes the address, folds it up into the little packet, seals it. There's the 2 bits of the seal that would have held it together, and there's the postmark for Goslar. And then off it goes. And Coleridge, we can only imagine, must have been thrilled to receive it. And an earlier letter that they'd written to him, which included some blank verse, Coleridge had said, I should have recognized anywhere. And had I met these lines running wild in the deserts of Arabia, I should instantly screamed out, Wordsworth. So there, a magnificent manuscript, which has got some of the earliest lines of the prelude, but also embodying this relationship between William, Dorothy, and Coleridge in Germany, a land where, as I said, they struggled, certainly the Wordsworth struggled with the language, and embodying this friendship of these 3 remarkable people. And that's the story of a manuscript that goes beyond the words. Much closer to home. When you've visited the museum, we invite you to stand on the roof of it. And we've created a viewing station giving a similar view to that which the Wordsworths would have enjoyed from their garden terrace. So our hope is that everyone will have access to the view that the Wordsworths enjoyed. 2/3, I think they said, of the valley, and where Wordsworth understandably wrote, here should be my home, this valley be my world. And standing there and looking at the mountains with this wonderful closed-in feeling, you really can feel that this is a world within a world, or as the Wordsworth called it, a home within a home, a love within a love. And a cup of tea and a cup of coffee, which are very attractive. Even our coffee cups, if I could show you, when Emily here has drunk the first inch or 2 of her coffee, you would see that the words of Wordsworth from the word wall are repeated inside our coffee cups. So we have all of us one human heart stays with you from the word wall through the visit and right through to your coffee afterwards. But what are the people facing the barriers outlined earlier? However much we adapt the site physically and intellectually, there are many people who can't or won't visit. Here, to conclude, are a few examples of how William and Dorothy's writings have, we believe, lived and done good. With Lancaster University, we created a massive open online course, or a MOOC, Poetry, People, Place, for people who told us that they'd long wished to know William and Dorothy's writings or had been put off poetry at school and wished to give it, and again, this is a phrase that come up more than once, to give it one more try. The course placed the writing in the context of place and highlighted what we can learn from manuscripts. 22,000 people have attended this course over the last few years, leading to many of them visiting the site. And there's one or two typical, I mean, we had a lot of nice comments from this, wonderfully appreciative comments, and people who felt that they'd come to know the poetry, the writing, the journals, and Dove Cottage. Perhaps surprisingly, William's poetry is central to a module of the International Master's Programme for Managers at Lancaster University. Simon Bainbridge leads managers on a journey through the Central Lakes on foot and in canoe, discussing the self-reflective nature of William's prelude, and in particular, the life-changing moments, spots of time. The journey ends in our Jerwood Centre, with managers seeing firsthand the manuscripts which contain the lines that they've been studying. And there we are, enjoying manuscripts and the books. In fact, the manuscript I've got in my hand is the manuscript that holds the lines of the prelude, some of which made their way into the Goslar letter that we've just been looking at. And you can see a comment there, the most profoundly impactful learning and development experience of my life. We've delivered many immersive courses for students from the UK and the USA, involving hands-on experiences with manuscripts and time spent in local places the Wordsworths knew. Here we see students lying in John's Grove, a place William and Dorothy associated with their brother John. In her journal, Dorothy describes a shared moment spent here in April 1802. William heard me breathing and rustling now and then, but we both lay still and unseen by one another. He thought that it would be a sweet thus to lie so in the grave, to hear the peacefulish sounds of the earth, and just to know that our dear friends were near. Brother John tragically died. He drowned, aged 32, and with a group of students from Amherst College, we studied William and Dorothy's letters around the time of his death and spent time in John's Grove. And afterwards, one student wrote, "My week in Grasmere has given me the opportunity to explore my own complex selves and internally validate my work. I didn't know that reading an old white man's poetry would make this brown girl cry. I feel affirmed in my work, and for once I can see how my art can transform and transcend. Seeing another artist like William helped reinforce my poetic resistance and push against the bounds of the English language. I've gained a newfound sense of self. I also found how therapeutic being in Dove Cottage, being in the manuscript room, reading poetry was for me, especially reading about John Wordsworth and his relationship with his brother William. My stepfather passed away in an accident that should not have happened, akin to John's freak accident 2 miles away from shore. It was the first time that I felt at peace with his death in a long time, and I wouldn't have known that going across the sea and reading how Wordsworth dealt and not dealt with John's death was liberating for me. I think now I can finally mourn. I haven't had time to in so long, and I think that now I can maybe write about him again." After a course with us, students from the University of Texas in El Paso created a number of lessons with children in their local elementary school. We sent them quills and folded facsimile letters, as was the Regency style that we've just looked at, the Goslar letter that we looked at, and they each wrote me a letter. I distributed them to local people and then wrote a letter back, and then each person wrote a letter back to a designated child. Thus, during 2020, people of Cumbria and Texas were connected. And the teacher of these young people was very appreciative. And this particular one at the end that struck me. Some of my students have never left the city of El Paso, Texas, so it was exciting for them to visit England. Our own education department welcomes children and students of all ages, site visits, visits to schools, and now virtual tours of Dove Cottage. We've partnered with universities and arts organisations to create projects that include multi-school and intergenerational experiences. And this is just one example of many. And this is part of Reimagining Wordsworth. A student from Furman University in South Carolina followed up her course in Grasmere by creating a Dorothy Wordsworth-inspired reflective reading program, partnering with the South Carolina Cancer Support Community, and that's an ongoing project. Through the inspirational leadership of their manager, Lillian Simmons, of Hospice at Home, West Cumbria, nurses wrote a collaborative poem. Each nurse contributed lines in answer to the question, if I had dementia. The collaborative poem helped us to talk about difficult subjects in a non-threatening way and help us to reflect on the work that we do, wrote one nurse. This is an initial response, as it were. Poetry is not my thing. I much prefer to have a sing, to go outside and take a look at what's around or read a book. But in time, people, this actually, the woman who wrote this did write many poems during the lockdown period. This is the poem in response, the group poem that was written, and it did help the nurses, they said, to put themselves in a different position. If I had dementia, I'd want you to know I'm a sensitive soul. I have a sense of humour, a sweet tooth. I cannot sit or lie still. I love animals, the outdoors, my garden. Picture sitting on the right, Barbara, living alone in West Cumbria and largely isolated from neighbours, has taken great pleasure this summer in writing mini dramas of imagined conversations between Dorothy and her neighbours. And these are stories taken from Dorothy's journal. And these will become part of our on-site interpretation. So local people will read from Barbara's script conversations that could have taken place outside the cottage, and there'll be a loudspeaker in the wall so that you can stand next to it and overhear what might have happened, what might have taken place a couple of hundred years ago. Barbara described this project in this very difficult year as being a lifeline to her. We've commissioned 3 artists to create a 21st century reimagining of the Wordsworth's Moss Hut, a structure resembling an upturned wren's nest, which was created in Dove Cottage Garden. Ours, a modern interpretation, is in the Sensory Garden. And the first group to read here was the Service Veterans Creative Writing and Poetry Group from Durham, and the visit being the final part of a series of workshops begun after a conversation with Wordsworth scholar Patty O'Boyle on Wordsworth's poetry of an encounter with a discharged soldier. The project involved Colpitt's poetry and Finchill training, and we hope to create a residential workshop for them in 2021. I think it was, I was told that at least some of these veterans were living with PS, post-traumatic stress disorder, PSSD. In 2019, a group of refugees now living in West Yorkshire spent a weekend with us, partnering with Glenthorne Quaker Guesthouse in Grasmere and the Children's Society in Leeds. They met with Nick McCullough, a poet then in residence with us, and himself a refugee from Uganda, for a weekend of walks. We explored the collection and their own writing, and we repeated this with a different group of refugees in 2020, this time via Zoom, on a virtual tour of the Valley and the Wordsworth manuscripts. And as with the hospice nurses, the refugees created a collaborative poem. And it's a wonderful poem because it shows the impact that even via Zoom, the refugees got a sense of the Wordsworth in their lives and the manuscripts. Love that sense of the manuscripts of once having been worn, because the manuscript paper was taken from linen, from old clothes. That sense that paper from old clothes, ink from oak trees, pens from swans and geese. And then coming to a close, the Parkhill Poets. The Parkhill Poets, for 15 years, we've created poetry in monthly sessions with them. They're based in Maryport on Cumbria's west coast. This has been a wonderful friendship, and we've learned a great deal from them. Their responses to William and Dorothy's writings have given us a fresh perspective, and they've made us laugh, and at times they've made us cry. And they've written their own responses. So, for example, to William's Idiot Boy. And this particular poem stands out for me. It's written by Philip Nixon, who you can see, who sadly passed away since this was done a few years ago. And it shows, I think, how poetry, the partnership between ourselves and the poets themselves and other supporters, can give a person confidence, can give a person a voice. And so this is Philip talking about his own disability and how his attitude has changed.
Yes, I am deaf, by Billy Nixon. Yes, I am deaf. I was born with a bone missing in my ear. And like a yo-yo in and out of the hospital, I have 55 operations over many years. I sometimes tell children make fun of me. They often call me names. But now I have a nice friend right here at Cos, and the co-op the same. Now I can turn off my hearing aid. I wouldn't hear the bomb going bang. Name no longer worries me. I am happy who I am. I sing, wrote poems, take photos of it. I am very proud. If someone said to me, "Are you deaf?" Yes, I am. I say out loud. That's it.
And I'll end with a film that will be in the new museum. It's a collaborative poem by the Parkhill Poets. It's read by Kevin Pardell, and it's in response to William's poem, Simon Lee. I mentioned it earlier. It's the poem where there is a tale in everything, so it tells what Wordsworth tells us. And just because Simon appears to be an old man not capable of taking an axe to a bow, don't make assumptions about him or about me. I'll end with this. Thank you for listening, if you haven't made it this far. And once this little film is finished, my contact details will come on the screen. So if there's anything that's inspired you that you'd like to work with us to do something similar, or something that will live and do good, help the poetry live and do good, please do get in touch with me. And thank you again for inviting me to give this talk.
Assumption, January the 8th, 2020. Assumption, young and full of life, red as a ripe cherry. That was us then and now. The changes between then I had, than I could, than I did. Remember, there is a time in me. Two sides to every story, or even 4, 5 or 6. My story doesn't stop there. New frontiers await me if people see me differently. Don't assume. Give me the tools. I can still make a Victoria sponge or jam or Rapoli. Now I wait. Now I can. Now I do. Try and stop me.